Hello, good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7 here in Cookadens in Glasgow in our studios at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. On behalf of us all here, a good new year to in and all, wherever you may be. And also to the guest that I have tonight, former MSP Maureen Watt. Maureen, delighted to see you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Donald, and a good new year to you and yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And as always, we start this evening with the Ukrainian update on day 314 of Russia's illegal attempt to occupy the sovereign country of Ukraine. Russia is planning a protracted campaign of attacks with Iranian drones to exhaust Ukraine, according to President Volodymyr Zelensky, who warned in his Monday night address. On national television in Ukraine, Yuri Ignat, spokesperson for the Air Force Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, has said that nearly 500 Russian drones have been downed since September. The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces has said up to 10 units of Russian military equipment of various types in occupied Makivka were damaged or destroyed. Now, Ukraine almost never publicly claims responsibility for attacks on Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine, but its military have reported that the Makivka attack is a strike on Russian manpower and military equipment, perhaps in contrast to the attacks that have been suffered by the Ukrainians from Russian armed forces. Satellite images taken by the US-based company Planet Labs that purportedly showed the aftermath of the strike on Makivka have circulated online, showing the building that allegedly housed the Russian troops before and after it was hit. The images, dated 2nd of January this year, show a building almost completely razed to the ground. The Ukrainian strike on that Russian base in Makivka, which is in Donetsk, has generated significant criticism of Russian military leadership, according to a recent report from the Institute for the Study of War. A number of prominent Russian pro-war bloggers and commentators acknowledged the attack on Makivka, with many suggesting the number of casualties was higher than the figures officially reported from Russia. President Zelensky has said he expects the first tranche of EU macro-financial aid to arrive in January after speaking to European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen on Monday. Zelensky thanked von der Leyen for her support, adding that the €18 billion worth of financial assistance is extremely important right now when Russia is trying to gather new forces for aggression. It is unlikely Russia will achieve a significant breakthrough near Bakhmut in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region in the coming weeks, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. And NATO countries will discuss their defence spending targets in the coming months, as some of them call for turning a 2% target into a minimum figure. Ukraine and the European Union will hold a summit in Kyiv on the 3rd of February to discuss financial and military support, President Zelensky's office said in a statement on Monday. Maureen, day 314, I think that quite a lot of the reviews of 2022 have begun with nobody would have ever thought there would be war in Europe in that particular year, but here we are going into, in a sense, almost the anniversary of the first attack. We don't seem to be seeing much progress for Russian aggression, but certainly a lot that the Ukrainians are doing in order to hold on to their sovereign territory.
Absolutely, and they can't do anything else because it would be Ukraine now and somewhere else bordering Russia after that. I mean, we know fine well what Putin's ideology is and what he believes in, and how Ukraine is the first country that's vital to him to recreating the old Soviet Union, if you like. So it is absolutely, in my view, really important that the West and NATO continue to back Ukraine because defeat of Ukraine would be absolutely catastrophic, not just for Ukraine, but as I say, countries bordering Russia. And while hand-to-hand fighting and war continues, in the end of the day, it's got to be a negotiation. There's word that Putin is willing to negotiate. If that's true or not, I'm not so sure. But in the end of the day, wars are usually finished and brought to an end by jaw rather than more war. But it's horrific to think that we're approaching the first anniversary of the beginning of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, and so many deaths and destruction. The utter destruction of Ukraine is just catastrophic and awful to watch.
Well, we go from destruction in a European context into what might actually be claimed to be destruction in a UK context, as the UK government are in denial over the NHS funding crisis. The UK government has said that it will be very difficult for some people to access for the NHS this winter, while insisting that Rishi Sunak has a properly funded plan in place to support a health service that many staff and experts say is near to collapse. Asked if NHS England was in crisis, Rishi Sunak's official spokesperson said, "This is certainly an unprecedented challenge for the NHS, brought about by a number of factors, most significantly the global pandemic. We are confident we are providing the NHS with the funding it needs, as we did throughout the pandemic, to deal with these issues. The difficulties are being experienced by the NHS services across the UK, with professional bodies and unions asking for greater investment in staff numbers, working conditions and wages. The RCN has gone on strike in England, Wales and Northern Ireland for the first time in a century. While the UK government insists it is offering to implement the NHS pay review body's award in full, the NHS unions question the independence of the pay review bodies, saying that their remit and parameters have been set by the UK government. RCN members are asking the UK government for a pay increase of inflation plus 5% to restore some of the real terms pay cut they say they have had over the past 10 years. Meanwhile, the Scottish Government has said it will implement the revised pay offer to the NHS Scotland staff in full, unless there is an increase in Barnett consequentials arising from increased investment by the UK Government in NHS England. The Scottish Government say that they are unable to offer more without cutting funding from elsewhere in an already stretched Scottish budget. Maureen, the NHS was described during the pandemic and has always been described as the jewel in the crown. Is it for the UK Conservative government more of a pain in the neck now, as they attempt to try and cover up the neglect that's been there for well over a decade?
I'm increasingly beginning to think, Donald, that this is exactly what they want to happen to the NHS, to get it down on its knees and say, oh, well, we can't sort it under the present way that the NHS is run, therefore we will start to privatise it. And I think it's important for people to remember that a few years ago, part of I think it was a hospital or a whole trust, I can't remember exactly, but it was privatised and it was handed back to the government because they simply couldn't make it work. So the idea that somehow privatisation is going to make us have a better health service is absolutely nuts, in my view. And we know that it's on its knees because of the huge number of vacancies. I mean, thousands and thousands of vacancies throughout all levels of staff in the NHS. And it's little wonder that the current workforce are feeling burnt out, demoralised, and totally and utterly neglected and rejected by this government. So I think the strikes, while not welcome, are understood. And unless there's more money in the short term put into the NHS to raise the morale of existing staff, recruit more staff, especially over the next few winter months where the NHS is dealing with still COVID, it's still there, flu at unprecedented levels, strep in both adults and children. And what we forget too is the increasing numbers of baby boomers who are becoming the frail and elderly a huge proportion of the population now needing more of the NHS's services, then there is no way out of this, I don't think, than increased funding, and the sooner it comes, the better.
And I suppose, in a sense, one of the questions that the majority of people then ask is, if it gets increased funding, where's this funding going to come from? But the Scottish Government are saying that their hands are tied, that unless there is some kind of significant uplift or the ability to borrow, that they can't actually meet the needs, not the demands, but the needs of this particular jewel in the crown.
Absolutely. And, it increasingly needs saying that austerity is a choice. Austerity is a choice of this Tory Westminster government. It needn't be like this. There are different ways of running your economy. And the way that the UK government are running this economy and austerity to make sure that any wealth created goes into the hands of the already wealthy needs to be hammered home again and again. And there is a different way by redistributing wealth, making everybody have more money in their pockets to spend, thereby increasing the activity in the economy, raising more taxes, and making businesses feel that they have a future and that enterprise is worth following and increasing.
And we go from one part of our community that is in crisis to another, which apparently tonight Network Rail are claiming that there is a deal to stop the UK train strikes that is within touching distance. The first of 5 consecutive days of national rail strikes have begun, closing much of Britain's rail network and leaving only a skeleton service for commuters on urban and intercity lines. Members of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union at Network Rail and 14 train operators are striking for 2 48-hour periods starting on Tuesday and then again from Friday. With signalling staff among the 40,000 RMT members on strike, much of the railway in Wales, Scotland and the less populous regions of England will not run at all, while service frequencies will typically be reduced to 1 train an hour on major routes. Downing Street has expressed optimism that a solution to the current wave of rail strikes could be imminent, after the chief negotiator for Network Rail said a deal was in touching distance. Fresh talks over the dispute are expected this week. While issues remain to be sorted, it is viewed as the public sector dispute most likely to be resolved first. Earlier, Tim Shoveller, Network Rail's chief negotiator, suggested the pay offered for rail staff could not be improved, but claimed better communication about the deal would begin to win over union members. Mr Shoveller said, "We only need 2,000 people who voted no last time to change their vote and the deal will pass." He told BBC Radio 4's Today programme that what they are saying to the RMT is that he knows that some areas had been misunderstood by some Network Rail staff, and he wants Network Rail to work with the RMT now to make clarifications where there's been misunderstanding and put the deal out again. Mick Lynch, the RMT General Secretary, blamed the UK government for blocking a settlement saying there was an unprecedented level of ministerial interference. He said, "We have worked with the rail industry to reach successful negotiated settlements ever since privatisation in 1993, and we have achieved deals across the network in 2021 and 2022 where the Department of Transport has no involvement." Mr Lynch said that in this dispute there had been an unprecedented level of ministerial interference, which is hamstringing rail employers from being able to negotiate a package of measures which would end the strike. Maureen, basically it would appear that according to Network Rail, either it is that these rail workers don't understand it, or that somebody's telling them something that's not true. And if they just all talk a wee bit more, then they'll understand that what's on the table is to their benefit, even though overwhelmingly there are so many people who've said that it's not.
If what you've described, Donald, really is a real mess, isn't it? We apparently the Westminster government is interfering in the Network Rail negotiations, but leaving other areas vital, like the health service, and not coming round the table with the health service unions. Um, as in terms of Network Rail, I mean, it needs repeating, of course, that this is Scotland has no trains, not because of ScotRail, but because of Network Rail and them in charge of signalling and the rail tracks, etc. Which is a real shame, since ScotRail negotiated with the Scottish Government recently and accepted the terms of the pay rise. So it is unfortunate that Scotland suffers because of this. I mean, I think it's good that the unions are saying there does need to be change, and there certainly does need to be change in terms of the way the railways are run. But I think, again, that there could be a negotiated settlement if people really got round the table and negotiated and went into the night, as they used to do under Labour, to make sure that a deal is reached. But, all sectors of the economy, especially in the more populated areas, are suffering because of this rail strike. And the sooner it's settled, the better. I mean, it's disrupted so many families over Christmas in terms of getting to see relatives and friends. And it really has, upset people during what should have been a very happy time.
And of course, ScotRail, as we know, is in public ownership and has settled, and they are in a position where they would be able to work if what is the privatised part of the rail service was actually able to operate. But it's not able to operate. And I suppose there is a theme for many critics of the British government that, where they have brought in private operators who are seeking profit. And I think it was Mick Lynch who has said over the last few months that you look at the profit that is going in to private equity firms, out of the railways, out of the networks, away from the public service ideal of railways, that what we're ending up with is not even a skeleton service. We're ending up with a service that's hidebound, because on the one hand, people can't manage their own personal economies through what they're being paid, and on the other hand, the rest of the country is at a standstill, purely and simply because not leaves in the line, but negotiations in the bin.
Yeah, and profits out of the country as well, Donald. That is a big part of the ruination of the UK economy at the moment, into funds in the Cayman Islands and goodness knows where else. But, even if the Scottish part of Network Rail was devolved to the Scottish Government, that would help, because we seem to be better at negotiating and avoiding strikes than this UK Westminster Tory government. We did try very hard, and in Scotland, certainly when I was on the Rural Economy Committee, Network Rail in Scotland was working much better than in the rest of the UK, again, because it was a smaller unit, more easily managed and more quick to respond to problems. So the idea that, you need a huge organisation like Network Rail UK, I think in so many other areas has been proven to be not the case. And, if they devolved the Scottish part of Network Rail to the Scottish Government, I think we could probably have avoided this situation.
And on to where we would hope that the UK government would be quick to respond is the news today that wholesale gas prices have fallen. The likelihood of power cuts in the UK this winter has therefore diminished significantly after that sharp fall in the wholesale price of gas. A spell of mild weather in the UK and Europe sent prices tumbling in a respite from the highs that led to soaring energy bills. European prices for delivery in February fell by 4.3% to €73.7 a megawatt hour, while the United Kingdom prices fell by 3.8% to 179 pence a therm. Recent warmer weather has reduced demand for heating in the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe, and conditions are expected to remain mild for the next 2 weeks. The situation has boosted optimism over gas supplies, which have been stretched since Russia reduced gas exports to Europe after its invasion of Ukraine. Last week, prices fell to their lowest levels since before the start of the war in February 2022. European nations had rushed to fill up gas storage facilities amid fears of shortages this winter. They have made good progress, creating optimism among traders and leading to prices easing. Traders also bet that a potential global recession would cut energy demand this year. Concerns remain over how Europe will replace Russian gas imports in the coming year, meaning prices are likely to remain high against historical averages. Prices peaked at about £5.50 a therm in August, far higher than the 50 pence per therm 10-year averages. Businesses and other energy consumers such as schools and charities are awaiting an update from the United Kingdom government on plans for an extension of a similar non-domestic initiative beyond March. Data from National Grid's electricity system operator on Tuesday showed that more than half of the power generated in the UK was from wind, with gas accounting for 21% and nuclear 17%. Maureen, gas prices fall, there's less of a demand. Why are we facing this large amount of bills increasing and so on, and pressure on our personal finances?
And I think that's a question that needs to be asked of the UK government as soon as Parliament reconvenes after the Christmas break. It is ridiculous that prices are falling, wholesale prices are falling, but yet we are seeing no fall in the price that ordinary consumers and indeed businesses are paying. And as you mentioned, Donald, we still have the ridiculous situation that electricity prices are linked to gas prices rather than maybe an average of all the different sources of energy that we have. And that in itself would bring down the price that consumers have to pay, certainly for electricity. But, you know, while you said that some European countries are still reeling from the effect of the cutoff of Russian gas, Germany, for example, have made huge strides and taken quite drastic measures in order to reduce its reliance on gas from Russia. And we have seen none of these measures taken in the UK, you know, perhaps like dimming street lights and definitely reducing the temperature in buildings and things like that. And we've seen no evidence or any figures on how consumption of energy, either domestically or business-wise, has been affected. I haven't seen any, and I've kept looking to see what the effect on the consumption of energy has been in the UK since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think this lack of transparency is typical of the way Westminster operates. And I hope not just in the chamber, but also on the relevant committees, that this is examined pretty quickly in Westminster.
And as we go from one gap between electricity and gas prices and them being paid together, we go to another gap that, good news today, that the gender pay gap in Scotland is lower than the rest of the United Kingdom. Figures from the Office for National Statistics have shown that the gender pay gap for all employees in 2022 was 12.2%, lower in Scotland than the rest of the UK, which is at 14.9%. The gap for full-time employees was also lower at 3.7% in Scotland compared to 8.3% in the United Kingdom. Statistics also show that the gender pay gap has been lower in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK since 2003. Commenting, SNP MSP Gillian Martin said, it is extremely encouraging to see that Scotland continues to outperform the UK in making sure women are paid the same as men for doing the exact same job. Women should not be economically less well off throughout their working lives, and there are structural issues that need to be addressed, not least the burden of caring still falling to women. This is the biggest driver of the gender pay gap, and one of the Scottish Government is actively addressing, particularly in its early years provision. There is still a lot of work to do before we see a zero gender pay gap in Scotland. I would encourage all employers to ensure their employees are paid fairly and equally, and to look at how they can provide the conditions women workers need to progress. Maureen, good news, but it's still not shut. There's still work to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. It is very good news, and I am quite surprised actually that we are doing so well in Scotland. I mean, coming from the northeast and knowing traditionally how women in the oil and gas industry, for example, were paid so much less than their male counterparts. It is interesting to see that Scotland is outperforming the rest of the UK, and I think that must be in some part due to the better provision of early years childcare in Scotland, and seeing the benefits of that. But we still need to make sure that women have the opportunities through having proper childcare to go for the jobs that pay more and are not stuck in low paid jobs. And we also need, through restructuring of our social care system, to make sure that working in that sector is more attractive to both sexes, and that we see career progression in more of the industries and in more of the jobs that are traditionally done by women. But good news.
Certainly is, and one job that is going in the opposite direction potentially is over in the US House of Representatives, who are attempting, as we speak, to elect a new speaker. Now, of course, Nancy Pelosi was the former House of Representatives Speaker, and Kevin McCarthy has been seeking far-right backing to win the US House of Representatives Speaker vote. The new Congress has opened with House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy grasping for his political survival, with the potential to become the first nominee for Speaker in a century to fail to win initial support from his own colleagues in a high-stakes vote for the gavel. And we can reveal that he has actually failed to win the first round of voting. Lawmakers convened today to a new era of divided government as Democrats have relinquished control of the House after mid-term election losses, although the Senate remains in Democrat hands. But first, the House Republicans must elect a Speaker, and clearly Kevin McCarthy has not got the support and trust of all of the Republicans in the House. He headed into the vote with no guarantee of success, and that is what was proven. The Republican from California had entrenched detractors within his own ranks, and despite his own attempts to cajole, harangue and win them over, even with an endorsement from the former President Donald Trump, he has fallen short. The showdown now looks like turning into a prolonged House floor fight, a spectacle that will divide the Republican Party, weaken its leadership, and consume the first days of this very new Congress. There is a new generation of Trump-aligned Republicans who are leading the opposition to McCarthy because they believe he is not conservative enough or tough enough to battle Democrats. Reminiscent it is of the last time Republicans took back the House majority, which came after the 2010 midterms, when the Tea Party class ushered in a new era of hardball politics, eventually sending Speaker John Boehner to an early retirement. It takes a majority of the House's 435 members, that's 218 votes, to become Speaker. With a slim 222-seat caucus, the Republicans, whichever man or woman they back, can only afford a handful of detractors. A speaker can win with fewer than the 218, as did both Pelosi and Bona, if some lawmakers are absent or simply vote present. Kevin McCarthy has so far failed to win over that growing group of extreme right-wing Republicans, which were led by the Conservative Freedom Caucus, despite weeks and weeks of closed-door meetings and promised changes to the House rules. There were 10 who voted for another candidate and 9 within the House of Representatives who voted for others outside of the two principal candidates, one a Republican, being McCarthy, and Hakeem Jeffries, being the Democrat. This prospect of holdouts causing half-book on the first day has launched a counter-offensive from Republicans frustrated that the detractors threaten the workings of the new Congress. A sizable but less vocal group of McCarthy supporters started its own campaign called Only Kevin as a way to shut down the opposition and pledge their support only to him. Mr. McCarthy has vowed to fight to the finish, however, and will go multiple rounds of painstaking floor votes if necessary, a sight last seen in Congress in a disputed speaker's race of 1923. Maureen, John Berco's sitting at home doing nothing. Do you think we should send him across the water?
Good try. Yes. I'm sure. I'm sure they've got lots of John Bercows over there, and I don't think they shout order, order. And certainly, Nancy Pelosi was a very good speaker, and I think we ought to pay tribute to all the work that she did to keep that house in order, if you like. But it just shows how the right is really split in the US, and how while it would seem that Trump supporters still have the ascendancy among the elected members of the House of Representatives, it does show, I think, that some Republicans are waking up to the damage. More and more Republicans, I think, are waking up to the damage that Trump has done, not just to their party, but to America, the US as a whole. And I thought it was very interesting listening to the President's Biden's Christmas address, where he concentrated on peace and goodwill and the need for more harmony among the US politicians. And now, of course, what's playing out is showing that there certainly is any peace and harmony. But it will be interesting to see what happens. I hope perhaps that the Democrat will win through a divided Republican Party, but we'll wait and see how it plays out.
Indeed, harmony. Those of us of a certain age remember it as a hairspray, which is quite ironic when you think of the former president's relationship to his hair. But we go from
I can tell you he wore Elnett hairspray, because I smelt it when he came into the committee room when he was in the Scottish Parliament many years ago.
I always wondered whether it was mixed with some sort of glue. When we move from one extreme right to another, to Israel, where extreme right Israeli minister has visited the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. The extreme right Israeli minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has visited Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque compound for the first time since becoming a minister, which has angered Palestinians, who see the visit as a provocation. Ben-Gvir's visit on Tuesday came days after he took office as the National Security Minister, a position that gives him powers over the police. Observers have said this step, seen by the Palestinian Authority as a major provocation, could result in deadly violence and escalate tensions in the occupied territories and among Muslim citizens of Israel. The compound, which lies within the Israeli-annexed East Jerusalem, is administered by the Waqf Islamic Affairs Council, with Israeli forces operating there and controlling access. The Al-Aqsa compound is the location of Islam's third holiest shrine, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Muslims have prayed there since the 7th century and retained exclusive prayer rights there following Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem after the 1967-60 war. Under long-standing arrangement, Jews can visit the compound but not pray at what is believed to be their holiest site, on which biblical temples once stood, the second of which was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Ben Gvir was filmed touring the esplanade near the mosque with police and aides. WACF guides reported that he was accompanied by units of the Israeli security forces, while a drone hovered above the holy site. Ben Gvir has visited Al-Aqsa numerous times since entering Parliament in April 2021, but his presence there as a senior minister carries far greater weight. A controversial visit in 2000 by the then opposition leader Ariel Sharon was one of the main triggers for the Second Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, which lasted until 2005, a whole 5 years. The Palestinian Authority called the visit an incursion to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and an unprecedented provocation. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates also condemned the visit. Ben Gvir, the Jewish Power Party leader, entered mainstream politics with the backing of Benjamin Netanyahu. He has called for Arab Israelis deemed disloyal to the state to be expelled and for the annexation of the occupied West Bank. Provocation. It's clearly designed to be a signal, a wolf whistle to his supporters and some kind of message to his detractors. But the end result is always the same, isn't it? It ends up with somebody paying the price, and often the innocents are the victims.
Absolutely. I mean, as you say, it definitely seems to be a provocative act. But the next question is, to what end? I mean, why is he doing this? Is it just to back up, to give succor to his own supporters? Again, to what end? I mean, the Middle East obviously has fallen down the agenda and the spotlight of the news because of Ukraine and other crises, but it continues to rumble away to the detriment of all those in the Middle East, and particularly as we're talking about now around in Israel and surrounding countries. Clearly, the new government is not interested in Israel, is not interested in any sort of peace talks and peace negotiations, and until someone, perhaps from the United States or some other country, tries to broker some sort of peace deal. Remember, it was Norway, I think, who many years ago managed to get a peace deal almost there, and when other big countries came in, it kind of fell apart. So, we've always got to live in hope there, and it's an area that I would love to visit, but it needs to be more stable and more secure, I think, before I would feel confident about going.
And it's certainly a part of the world where extremes are prevalent around almost every corner. You have Netanyahu making his return in Israel. We've had the World Cup in an area of the Middle East where some have described it being there as sports washing. We have a number of sports organisations which are finding the Middle East quite alluring. The filthy lucre has been out on the table, and they have taken and they have gone, and whether it be in Bahrain, whether it be United Arab Emirates or in the Saudi Arabia. And yet here also the old battleground, as it were, of the Middle East also is still coming back and back and back, and seems to not getting closer to a solution over time.
Yes. There doesn't seem to be any will at all to get to any solution in that part of the world. And as you say, oil money is making parts of the Middle East more attractive to people for whom money is everything. And obviously, the World Cup in Saudi Arabia did make it look attractive to many, but you should never forget that in surrounding countries, things are really bad. I mean, if you look at Lebanon, which was once a really good country to visit, like Scotland, you could ski in the morning and swim in the sea in the afternoon. It has just been totally destroyed by factionalism, and until people learn to work together, then so much prosperity just passes people by, and they live in abject poverty as a result of powerful people sometimes just playing games with their lives, actually. Perhaps that a
Absolutely.
bit simplistic, but I just feel like that.
Absolutely. And the call for people to work together has also come today from John Kerry, who's called on rich countries to respond to anger in the developing world over climate change. People in developing countries are feeling increasingly angry and victimised by the climate crisis. The US climate envoy John Kerry has warned, and rich countries must respond urgently. He said, "I've been chronicling the increased frustration and anger of island states and vulnerable countries and small African nations and others around the world that feel victimised by the fact that they are a minuscule component of emissions, and yet they are paying a very high price. 17 of the 20 most effective countries in the world by the climate crisis are in Africa, and yet 48 sub-Saharan countries total 0.55% of all emissions." The COP27 UN Climate Summit in Egypt in November of last year was nearly derailed by a bitter row between rich and poor nations over loss and damage, the term for the most severe impacts of climate disaster and the means of rescuing and rebuilding poor nations affected by them. The United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom and other rich nations eventually agreed to a new fund for loss and damage without saying how much money would be in the fund or where the finance would come from. John Kerry insisted the US was committed to helping the developing world with loss and damage, but that the details of the fund would need more work in 2023. Mr. Kerry asked, "How can you look somebody in the eye with a straight face and not accept the notion that there are damages and there are losses?" He said that we can see the damage and losses around the world in higher intensity storms, in rising sea levels, in fires and in flooding. The US climate envoy said, "How you manage loss and damage is still at issue. Do you approach this challenge of the financial arrangements?" But it was important to acknowledge that they're there, and we have to work at this in good faith. Next year's COP28 talks will be held in the United Arab Emirates, a major oil producer, and some have raised concerns that this could open up opportunities for oil lobbyists to slow progress. There were more than 630 fossil fuel lobbyists at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and pushback from oil-producing countries prevented stronger resolutions from being passed on the phase down of fossil fuels and on reaffirming the global target of limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. While discussions on climate finance are urgently needed, cutting emissions must also be a key focus, Kerry further insisted. Some scientists and observers of the climate talks warned after COP27 that the 1.5 target was being lost. Kerry rejected that view, but agreed that it would require far greater efforts. Maureen, I've been seeing on the news there that the snow is not coming out on the piste, so therefore these people who want to get away and do all this skiing, the ones that are able to do all that, might actually have to pay some of this malarkey some attention and maybe put some shoulders to the wheel and effort into slowing down the climate crisis.
Yes, but I suspect there will be that usual trip to Davos in the beginning of the year, whether there's snow there or not, by the rich and the wealthy to think of ways that they can keep all the wealth to themselves. in the meantime, in terms of loss and damage, it was our own First Minister who went there to Sharm el Sheikh early on in the talks and committed, made a speech on loss and damage and committed money. I think, part of the first monies that was committed to the fund. And I can totally understand the anger of developing countries. But I think on a micro level, if you like, rather than the macro level that we're talking about in terms of COP, and the talks that John Kerry is involved in. If we take Scotland's relationship with Malawi, for example, when they had the terrible floods that came in from Madagascar and right over into Malawi a few years ago, Scotland stepped up to the plate right away and gave extra funding to secure clean water supplies. We see through our relationship with the Scotland-Malawi partnership and the Malawi-Scotland partnership, our efforts as a small country to another small country to increase their clean water supplies, to increase the use of solar power at the water pumps and solar power on schools and various other buildings. So I think, countries like ourselves and Norway and other Scandinavian countries are doing our bits on a micro level, if you like, to help developing countries. But it needs many more developed countries to be helping in ways like that to create that real difference. And I think that real difference comes when at the negotiations and the talks among leaders, that real difference can be made.
And from the worry of climate crisis, we have noted today that the support for home ownership in Scotland as first-time buyers and others on low to medium incomes are being encouraged to take advantage of the open market shared equity scheme to help buy a home in 2023. The scheme allows people to buy a home without having to fund its entire cost and is available across Scotland to priority access groups, including people aged 60 and over, first-time buyers, social renters, who are people who rent from the council or a housing association, disabled people, members of the armed forces, veterans who have left the armed forces within the past 2 years, widows, widowers and other partners of service personnel for up to 2 years after their partner has lost their life while serving. Scottish Government Housing Secretary Shona Robison said, "We recognise the challenges people are facing in this cost of living crisis and want to help as many people as possible buy an affordable home this new year. This scheme puts applicants on a more level playing field with other buyers when purchasing an affordable home. Buyers can purchase a share of a property while holding the full title, with the Scottish Government funding the remaining share under a shared equity agreement." You mentioned, Maureen, about micro management of the climate. And one of the things I think that Scotland has got quite good at over the last 10, 12 years is working on a micro scale to look at things that somehow can make a significant difference to the lives of ordinary people. Whilst it might not get the front page of the Scotsman, the Herald, or even the Daily Record, what it actually does is make a massive difference to the lives of ordinary Scots. And here's another example, I would think, of how the Scottish Government, a state, can get involved in supporting the most vulnerable.
Absolutely. And to those who say that devolution isn't working and hasn't made any difference, you can see it on so many levels and in so many different ways as to how it can make a difference. And, to those that say that Scotland is too wee, well, here's an example of how being wee means that you can make that difference, because it's something that, as you say, can be micromanaged, if you like. And Scotland is small enough, and people know more about what's happening all over it, to see where we can make a real difference to people's lives. And by taking these steps to identify groups of people who could benefit from a particular scheme, I think is really innovative and really worthwhile to those people who, as you say, widows or widowers who might be struggling where they wouldn't normally expect to struggle, and the amount of help and assistance that has been given to Army and Air Force and Forces veterans by the Scottish Government over the past 10, 15 years has been immense in so many different ways. Working with local authorities, having local authority champions of veterans, and making sure that policies that are developed at local level as well as national level have people like veterans in their sights when developing policy. And I think this is a great initiative which will widen the access, if you like, to shared equity schemes and help people on the housing ladder, which is more difficult now than ever before. Our youngsters are, in order to get the massive amount that's required for a deposit. So these schemes are really worthwhile, and well done to the Scottish Government.
I think what was welcoming and surprising, I suppose, in equal measure is the mention not only of veterans but also of veteran families. I think that sometimes what tends to happen is that there's a criticism levelled at those in favour of social justice, that when it comes to the military we seem to be less supportive, but yet here we are, particularly for those who have served in our armed forces, being given some form of support that the Scottish Government are able to do.
Absolutely. I mean, our conversation has brought to mind a constituent of mine whose husband had been in the forces, was just leaving, and had taken his own life. And she was really struggling with her family to find suitable accommodation, and she wasn't aware that she was entitled to accommodation from the armed forces. Not on a base, obviously, but other accommodation through the forces. And it was great that we could find that out and help her in that way. So it is good that it's extended not just to the veteran themselves, but to their wider families.
And we move from home ownership in Scotland to a man whose first home was a stone throw away from where I was brought up, though you would have to have the arms of Tom Scotland to throw from Prestwick Road out to Alloway, as a rare Robert Burns Kilmarnock edition has gone on display in Dunfermline. This rare copy of Burns' first published poetry collection is on display in Dunfermline. The book, titled Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect, which was found in a barber shop in Shrewsbury in Shropshire, is missing its first 50 pages. The pages were said to have been ripped out by the owner to clean his razors. Burns enthusiast John Murison purchased the book in the late 19th century after spotting it in the shop sometime in the 1880s or the 1890s. The book is now on display at Dunfermline Carnegie Library and Galleries next to the Abbey Church, which Burns visited in 1787, and it will be on display until the 5th of February. There are only 612 copies of the Kilmarnock edition printed in 1786, and it is thought that only 84 of them survive. The book has to be housed in a conservation box paid for by the Dunfermline United Burns Club because of its fragile condition. It doesn't go on show very often because of that condition and its rarity. On Fife, which runs the Dunfermline Carnegie Library, has been unable to determine how the book found its way to Shropshire. The book is part of the Murison Burns collection, which is in the care of On Fife and consists of pottery, portraits and other items. John Murison was born in Glasgow and worked as a travelling seed merchant, a job that did indeed take him to Shrewsbury. Poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect will be displayed with other material from their collection, which consists of a total of 1,700 artefacts. The collection was bought by Sir Alexander Gibb, whose construction firm was responsible for building Rosyth Dockyard, and he gifted it the Dunfermline Carnegie Library in 1921. Now, Maureen, there are so many names in there, from Rosyth to Carnegie to Burns. It's a fitting beginning, if you like, to this year, given that our biggest celebration has just happened just a few 72 hours ago or thereabouts. But it's something culturally that can be lost, and yet we need to keep a hold of it. And I think if I go back to where we began tonight, many of the cultural relics that Ukraine are losing, that the Taliban get rid of in places like Afghanistan, that if we don't hold on to it and treasure it, much of what our past can tell us will be lost forever. So it's great to see this.
Yes, when I saw this story, I was wondering why it was at Dunfermline, because, as you say, Burns is always connected with Ayrshire and Dumfries and Galloway, and indeed his parents started off their farming lives in the Mearns near where I live. So I wasn't sure what the Dunfermline connection was, but it's great that Burns clubs are doing this sort of thing in terms of providing the housing and the casing so that this Kilmarnock edition can be displayed. And today I noticed in my inbox was my first invitation to speak at a Burns supper this year. So yes, we're coming up to that season again. And I hope the people of the new city of Dunfermline go and see what is a rare edition, and parents take their children to see how important it is, and how important it is to promote and make everybody aware of the works of our bard, who is so internationally renowned.
Indeed, I'm quite sure that the Mayor of Dunfermline, Mr. Leishman, will be up front and centre, making sure that people are aware that it's there. Well, Maureen, thank you for tonight, and thank you for joining us, and it's been a pleasure, absolute pleasure as always, and thank you for your contribution.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that is it for this evening, but before I go, and you know what's coming, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. I can't remember who it was that said the march of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. Well, if we all contribute a little, there are people who have the ability to spread that a lot. So perhaps it's not the first step we need, but given the time of year, it's the first foot, and a contribution towards our target of adding 10,000 new subscribers would enable us here to employ staff to make more programmes and contribute to the media opportunities and access to news stories and other things as well that we could do if we could only have a movement that is combined together. So from me here in Cookadens at our studios in Glasgow, it's good night, and thank you very much for watching.